is Open Mind Alexander Technique. I'm Jess. Today we're talking about Alexander Technique lessons. Why to take them, what to look for, and what to expect going in. So, Alexander Technique is simply not something that can be learned from YouTube. The reason that I have this channel is to, first of all, generate awareness, make sure that people know that it exists, because nobody can want to work with me if they don't even know that what I do is a thing. I also want to have a library available for my current and potential future students to say, hey, here's a whole set of videos that I've got about the way that I teach, or if I want a current student to have some extra practice with one particular concept in between their lessons with me, I can send them a video that's just on that activity or that idea and have them work with that. So I'll have that available. And I also just really enjoy teaching and I want to reach a wider audience. It's been such an incredibly powerful factor in my life and the lives of other people that I know who have worked with Alexander Technique that I just want more people to know about it and know that it's possible and it's available. So, what to look for in an Alexander Technique teacher? Well, certainly go to someone who is certified. I would absolutely hate to ever hear about someone getting injured or having a really negative experience with someone who claims to be an Alexander Technique teacher but actually isn't. There are different professional organizations that offer training courses around the world. I can't really speak to the ones that I haven't done because I don't know them and I don't know much about them. So I'm not really going to get into that, at least not in this video, or at least not until I get more experienced with that. All I can talk about is what my training was like and how to identify people who've had something similar. So the Alexander Technique professional world is centered around England and London in particular, because way back 100 years ago, Mr. Alexander's practice was in London, and that's where he established the first training course for teachers, and the first generation of teachers were all based around London. Since then, there are different offshoots that spread all over the world. I am in the American offshoot of that, and it's an affiliated society to that original professional organization. So the abbreviations for those organizations, the one in England is called STAT, Society for Teachers of Alexander Technique. And the American side of that, which has the same qualifications for the teachers and certification requirements, is AMSAT, American Society for Alexander Technique. So I'm AMSAT certified, and that means that I have 1,600 hours of training over a minimum of 3 years. And that is considered on the more rigorous and heavily structured side of training courses as far as I know. So things to look for in a teacher is certainly, are you fully certified? Did you do a full 1,600 hour training course with a minimum of 3 years? It's not considered a degree because it's not offered through a university. The actual teaching certification requirements are not a degree, but we call it generally a master's degree equivalent because that's how much time it takes and that's how much effort it takes. It's also extremely taxing and difficult in order to do. It was a really intense experience, but really wonderful going through training. Other things to think about is just, do you get along with your teacher? Can you have a conversation with them first? Are there any examples that they have of the way that they teach, the way they like to explain things? Do they really like the more jargon-based, having things with specific labels, and that's how they explain concepts? I'm certainly more on the non-jargon side of things. I generally would rather just explain what I mean, and I find that makes it more accessible. You'll also find all sorts of different personality differences in different teachers. It's really finding someone that fits well for you. Unfortunately, because there aren't, huge amounts of options to choose from in many places, you might not have many options in Alexander Technique teachers who are nearby you that you can work with in person. A lot of us do teach online. I can teach online lessons, and many people, especially after COVID, are willing to teach online lessons. But I tend to want to be pretty upfront with potential students. If they're only working online and can never get in for an in-person lesson, they might have reduced results. Because a lot of Alexander Technique work historically is taught with hands-on work. And that's what a lot of our training hours and experience and continuing education hours goes into. How are you using your hands? So hands-on work is instructional. This is not a massage. This is not therapy. This is not a cure. I don't treat anything. I don't cure anything. I am not a medical professional. I'm a teacher. I teach skills. And one of my teaching tools is my hands. And I use my hands in order to guide students into new patterns of coordination and also to be able to feel in them how much are they working? How are they using their muscles? What is the use of their selves like? So that's why we use our hands. But I'm one of the folks who is very firm that hands-on work is not an absolute requirement in order for it to be considered Alexander technique. There are some folks who disagree and think that Alexander technique must, by definition, have hands-on work. I don't think so. I think that it is the ethical thing to do to warn people like, hey, this is usually a tool that I use, and if we're not using this tool, you might have slightly less profound results than someone who does get the full range of my tool set as a teacher. But there's still certainly a lot of value to it and a lot that you can get from it. So what to know going into your first lesson? Really depends on the teacher. Many of us will have a particular intake sheet. I do, but the way that I work my intake sheet, I don't just hand it to my students and say, fill this out. It's not clinical like that. My intake sheet for me is just a guide to the questions I'm going to ask. And the way I handle it, I actually write down the answers. So I'm the one with the piece of paper, I'm taking notes. And I like to just ask my questions so that my student can just speak freely, and I'll write down things that I need from that. Some people are really adamant that they don't need to have any sort of like medical background information or anything like that. I ask some questions about any like major injuries and a couple of specific medical conditions that I really like to know about in advance so that I can just make sure that I'm not potentially going to put anyone at any risk whatsoever. That's important to me as someone who has some major medical issues. I know that I would certainly want my teachers to know, especially if they're going to use hands-on work for me, I would want them to know about mine before we get started. The only medical condition that we really do work with pretty differently compared to with most other students is one that I also have myself, which is why I know it's so important and you gotta work with it differently: hypermobility. Joint instability, connective tissue issues, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome in particular, that's actually going to be a different type of hands-on work. So that's something to keep in mind if you're hypermobile and you're looking to get into Alexander technique. Ask a lot of questions because not all teachers are trained to work with hypermobility. It's not considered part of the traditional core work set and qualifications for an Alexander certification. It's becoming more common now, and it was certainly part of my training because they all had to work with me, and so everyone I graduated with certainly can work with hypermobility because they had to work with me. But not everyone does, so check into that. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of medical limitations going on here. Any sort of like physical disabilities, neurological issues, all of that, we're fine with those. You just need to be pretty upfront about it and say, here's what I can do, here's what I can't do, here's what I'm willing to try, here's what I'm not willing to try. Communicate. Make sure you're communicating with a potential teacher, and especially once you get started in lessons, in particular if you're in person and you're doing hands-on work, communicate a lot. What are you experiencing? What are you noticing? The main barrier for Alexander technique lessons for most people is just access with, is there a teacher in your area? A lot of us tend to be employed within performing arts type fields, such as me. This is a university music school. It's really stuck around in the performing arts world in general because Mr. Alexander, back over 100 years ago, was an actor. And so he did a lot of teaching of other people in the performing arts. And that was based, again, in London. And so the London performing arts scene in particular, all of their major like drama schools, music schools, they've all got Alexander teachers on staff. That's also pretty common in the US. that a lot of our, maybe not tiny little like local schools, music schools, but certainly your big music schools will have generally Alexander Technique teachers on staff that offer lessons for credit. One other thing to keep in mind is the other barrier for access is cost. So an Alexander Technique teacher certification is the equivalent of a master's degree. And if you're working with someone with a master's equivalent in their subject, one-on-one, yeah, that's gonna cost. It varies depending on the teacher. There are some pretty big differences between what different teachers charge for lessons. So certainly ask about that in advance. Make sure that it's something that you are comfortable with and can stick with, because this is not something that you can learn in one lesson. It doesn't matter how fantastic the lesson is, you're not gonna get it in one. It doesn't work that way. We're working with habits. This is a long-term thing. So something to compare it to is something like music lessons, or the more aesthetic types of like skincare, facials, things like that, massage. You're kind of looking at the same ballpark of costs in general. Do keep in mind, if you're working with a teacher who has a cost that is a little bit out of your price range, that some teachers can find it completely acceptable to ask, hey, I would really love to take lessons, but I simply can't afford your price. Is there any way that we could work with that in some way? Do you offer a sliding scale? Some people are fine with that conversation. I'm fine with that conversation. I might say no, depending on what the offer is. I can't promise that, but I'm fine with the conversation. Some people are not fine with that conversation. So it's something to look for. If you kind of get a sense from their website or wherever you've heard about them that they might not appreciate being told that you can't actually afford to work with them at their stated cost, maybe don't offer that. So that's another thing to keep in mind. In general, Alexander Technique lessons are about investing in yourself. How can you make your whole self more optimized, more sustainable, and moving with more ease? So that's really the goal. So I hope this was a helpful little primer to know going in. Feel free to ask me any questions, get in contact with me in some way. My website also has a whole lot of informational materials, openmindat.com. Feel free to check it out, and I will have links in the description as well. I think that's about it.